What if everything you were taught about the fall of Rome was not entirely true? September 4th. For 76 AD, a date stamped in history textbooks, spoken with finality the day Rome fell. But what if that dramatic headline hides a quieter, more complex truth? What if, rather than collapse, Rome simply transformed? Let's set aside the romantic notion of sudden doom, of marble ruins collapsing overnight, and instead, take a journey across the shifting lands of Europe to discover what really happened when an empire gave way not to nothingness but to something new. If you open a history book, you'll probably find the year for 76 AD marked with a heavy underline, labeled as the year the Western Roman Empire fell. It's one of those dates that seems to echo with finality, as if an entire civilization collapsed overnight and the lights of the ancient world were suddenly switched off. But when you step away from the headlines and listen a little closer to the quiet streets of Roman towns, the routines of farmers, merchants, and local governors, you start to hear a different story. Because the truth is, for most people living in the empire, September 4th, 476 wasn't the beginning of chaos, it was just another day. There were no firestorms, no cities reduced to rubble, no grand speeches carved into stone declaring the end of an age. What happened was political, not apocalyptic. A teenage emperor named Romulus Augustulus. Ironic, isn't it, that he carried both the names of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor was quietly deposed by a Germanic commander named Odoacer. But even that didn't come with the dramatic crash we often imagine. There were no mobs in the streets, no revolt. The Roman Senate didn't resist. In fact, they supported the change. Why? Because by then, the empire in the West was already little more than a memory stitched together with titles and tradition. The real power had long since shifted east to Constantinople. And most of Italy was tired of civil wars, invasions, and emperors who came and went like seasonal winds. What Odoacer did was formalize what had already been true for years. He didn't destroy Rome. He stepped into its shoes. He kept the administration. He paid the soldiers. He respected the Senate. Latin still rang out in marketplaces. Roman law still guided courtrooms. People still bathed in aqueduct-fed baths and prayed in basilicas. And if you had asked a merchant in Ravenna or a baker in Rome whether the empire had fallen, they probably would have blinked in confusion. For them, the world hadn't ended, it had simply adapted. That's the part of history we often miss. The fall of Rome wasn't a thunderclap, it was a long sigh. A slow drift from one chapter into another. And if we really want to understand what happened in 476, we have to stop imagining a crumbling colossus and start seeing the quiet persistence of daily life, because sometimes the biggest changes don't start with an explosion. They begin in silence. Now here's something most people don't realize. After 476, Rome didn't vanish, it simply changed hands. Odoacer, the so-called barbarian who took control of Italy, didn't storm into Rome to tear down statues or burn scrolls. He walked into a world already Romanized and chose to keep it that way. He didn't see himself as a destroyer, but as a caretaker. He pledged allegiance to the emperor in Constantinople, minted coins in his name, and continued to govern under Roman law. In fact, many Romans may have felt more stability under Odoacer than they had under the string of short-lived, often chaotic emperors before him. Taxes were still collected, aqueducts still flowed, senators still met, and life in the administrative, structured, Roman sense carried on. In many ways, Odoacer didn't replace the Roman system, he revived its rhythm. And while Italy adjusted under this new leadership, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we often call the Byzantine Empire, wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Constantinople, with its soaring walls and golden domes, was pulsing with trade, wealth, and political energy. It had become the new beating heart of the Roman world, a city where Greek was spoken more than Latin, but where Roman tradition still shaped every decision. The Emperor Zeno, though unpopular at times, held things together with a fierce grip, fending off rivals and rebellions while reinforcing the idea that Rome hadn't died, it had simply shifted east. And here's the beautiful contradiction. While Western historians mark 476 as the end of an era, the Romans of the East didn't see it that way at all. To them, their empire was still very much alive. It had endured invasions, betrayals, and civil wars, yet it remained. The Senate still existed, the bureaucracy still functioned, and the dream of Rome as an idea, as a structure, as a civilization wasn't buried. It was being rebuilt. So when people talk about the fall of Rome, they're often thinking of a world that ended in flames, but the real story, it's more like a torch being passed across the sea from the old city to the new, from the crumbling west to the ascendant east. And that torch would burn for nearly 1,000 more years. Step beyond Italy, and the story of 476 becomes even more fascinating, because while Rome was reconfiguring itself, the rest of Europe was waking up to a new kind of reality. In the lands once colored red on Roman maps, a patchwork of new kingdoms was taking root not in defiance of Rome, but often because of it. The Visigoths, who had once sacked the Eternal City, now ruled parts of Gaul and Spain, not as outsiders, but as rulers who dressed like Romans, spoke Latin, and governed from old Roman cities, in Carthage. The Vandals built a maritime empire so powerful that Rome could never take Africa back from them, no matter how many fleets it sent. And in the north, among mist-covered forests and windswept plains, the Franks were just beginning their climb, with names like Childeric and Clovis soon to echo across centuries. But these weren't the dark, chaotic realms we often imagine when we hear barbarian kingdom. Many of these societies were deeply Romanized. They inherited Roman buildings, Roman tax systems, Roman law, and even Roman dreams. Some even saw themselves not as destroyers of the empire, but as its natural successors, the next guardians of a tradition too large to be owned by one city. Of course, that didn't mean it was peaceful. There were wars, rivalries, betrayals, just as there had always been in Rome. But what's striking is how quickly these so-called barbarian realms embraced the structures Rome left behind. They minted coins, held courts, and debated laws in the ruins of Roman forums. Latin remained the language of power, and Christianity, once persecuted by emperors, had now become the unifying force that stitched these new worlds together. It's easy to look back and think of this time as a fall, but in many ways, it was a transition. The Western Roman Empire didn't vanish into smoke. It fractured into something else. And in those fractures, new cultures were born. Cultures that would eventually become the modern nations we know today. What happened after 476 wasn't the end of civilization. It was the planting of seeds that would take centuries to grow, but that were already stretching toward the future. And if you were standing in Gaul or Hispania or North Africa in those years, you might not have thought you were living in a broken world. You might have simply felt that you were living at the beginning of something new. The funny thing about endings is that they rarely behave the way we expect them to. Rome's supposed fall didn't leave behind a smoking crater, it left behind stories. Not official ones etched in marble or recorded by senators, but whispered ones, carried on the breath of people who had lived through it all. You wouldn't find them in libraries or scrolls, but in kitchens, in barracks, in market stalls. In the daily rituals of those who swept Roman floors or served Roman meals or buried Roman coins under their doorsteps because that's what their fathers had done. What remained after 476 wasn't just ruins or broken statues, it was a quiet kind of defiance, the kind that survives in memory long after swords have been dropped. The enslaved who once marched with Salvius or Athenian, who crowned themselves kings for a season and dared to believe in freedom, may have been crushed in the fields of Sicily. But their voices weren't silenced. They lived on in the minds of those who had nothing left but memory. And that memory had a strange power. It didn't topple cities or defeat armies, but it made people ask questions. What if Rome wasn't unshakable? What if emperors could bleed, and systems could be challenged, and people at the bottom could rise, even if just for a moment? It was this kind of quiet, persistent memory that reached a young man named Spartacus, decades later, far from Sicily, inside the walls of a gladiator school in Capua. He wasn't there when Triocala fell. He didn't hear Athenians' last words. But the stories reached him, maybe told by an old gladiator who once served in the legions, or a slave who remembered whispers from their childhood. And when his time came, he didn't rise because of a prophecy or a plan. He rose because something inside him broke the same way it had broken in Sicily. And when it did, the fire lit again. It wasn't the same rebellion, but it carried the same heartbeat. Rome saw it and recognized the rhythm. Because this wasn't new, it was an echo. The Second Servile War didn't end with total silence. It ended with a question, one that Rome never quite found the courage to answer. How long can a system built on exploitation survive before the exploited stop asking for change and start taking it? That's the legacy of those forgotten rebels, not in the cities they failed to hold, but in the courage to believe they might, even for a fleeting moment, be free. And history, though it often glorifies victors, never fully forgets those who dared to speak through fire. So what really happened in 476 AD was at the end of the Roman Empire, the final fall of ancient civilization, the moment history turned out the lights on 1,000 years of power and glory. That's what the textbooks used to say. But when you look closer, not through the lens of collapse, but through continuity, you see something else entirely. You see an empire shifting rather than dying, reshaping itself across new borders and languages and leaders. You see old cities still standing, still functioning, still speaking Latin, and keeping Roman law, even under the banners of new kings. You see Rome, not as a place on a map, but as an idea so deeply rooted that even its enemies chose to wear its clothes and borrow its titles. What ended in 476 wasn't Rome, it was a version of it. A phase, a chapter. The institutions didn't disappear overnight. The culture didn't dissolve into dust. The people didn't wake up to a new world, they woke up to the same streets, the same routines, the same sky. But underneath that familiarity, the world was undeniably changing. Power was no longer centralized. The idea of empire was being tested, stretched, reimagined. In its place, something more fractured, more localized, but also more diverse began to rise: kingdoms, tribes, principalities, each carrying pieces of the Roman legacy while adding their own identity to the mosaic. And in that mosaic, the foundations of modern Europe were quietly forming. France, Germany, Spain, Italy, not born in a day, but slowly taking shape through centuries of transition, rooted in Roman soil, watered by the struggles and dreams of countless generations. So maybe the fall of Rome wasn't a fall at all. Maybe it was a handoff, a passing of the torch from the old to the new. And if we stop looking for a singular moment of collapse and instead pay attention to the slow, human process of change, we begin to see the truth. History is not about endings. It's about evolutions. And for 476, it wasn't the end of the world. It was the beginning of the one we live in now.